Is the addict more spiritual than the non-addict? Are they genuinely wired or oriented in a certain way that they're seeing reality and morality from a different angle to the rest of us, which would be very wise to pay attention to? Or are they merely repeating on unfortunate, traumatic, self-fulfilling negative regressive spirals based on unresolved childhood trauma? This is the question that I want to explore in this episode of Inner Work Essentials because it's a topic which is really close to my heart. As someone who's currently 3 years sober from drink, drugs, and pornography, I have had my share of struggles along the way in trying to understand just why I keep doing things, or used to keep doing things, which would hurt me, which would dishonor my own sense of agency, which would abuse my body, which would frazzle my mind, which would waste my time and my energy so compulsively and so addictively, right? And yet at the same time, I also have this element of curiosity towards states which are different to the everyday reality. I'm someone who's got more of a mystical bent, more of a spiritual leaning, and I am genuinely interested in meditative states, expanded consciousness, and all of that wonderful esoteric goodness which lays at the higher echelons of human maturation. So how do we cross this gap? Well, that's what I want to explore in this episode of Inner Work Essentials. I want to approach addiction from an angle which you're maybe not used to considering. The angle that we're typically fed into when we start learning about how to heal our addictions is, initially, at the very least, we start to come into contact with this idea that addiction is fundamentally symptomatic of trauma. It arises out of trauma. It's not that addiction is the trauma loop itself or is the damaging loop itself. It's that any addiction to any drink, drug, sex, shopping, screens comes out of a feeling of unsafety in the body, a feeling of I don't want to be here and I don't like being here, so I'm gonna dislocate my attention, or I'm gonna artificially pump up a different state of being in my body to try and take a break from myself. It's actually a very healthy and life-saving defense mechanism at times. I'm not saying that to be drug addicted is healthy, but people who are struggling from mental health challenges or other unresolved traumas and real dark energy, for them to find a drug at a certain time in their life and be able to step out of that, even if it's chronic, even if it's unhealthy, it does open up the possibility of change in the future rather than immediately taking their own life in the present. So I'm not trying to take away from the complexity and also the potential nobility of the addict's path, but I don't want to unnecessarily glamorize it either. What needs to be done to really unravel addiction from the single perspective, though, is introduce a complementary perspective, which can be difficult to achieve when we see addiction as a single entity of trauma response or a variety of ways to deal with the damage which still festers inside of us. And this is to recognize, at first, for wholeness, this is to recognize that there is a genuinely self-actualizing, individuation-seeking, higher consciousness, craving part of ourself that actually wants that sense of euphoria. We want that state of cognizance, that state of lucidity, that feeling that often people confuse with being just a drug-based elation, which we can actually get through sober states. I know this personally. In the last 3 years, I haven't touched drink or drugs. I haven't even orgasmed to a large degree. I've been on the semen retention journey. It's possible. It's really possible to access these euphoric states. But the question of addiction and healing addiction is really an understanding from these two angles. How do we navigate the trauma from the past, what we're running away from, And how do we healthily move towards a higher state of being without getting lost into dissociative, mystical escapism? That's what I'm going to try and explore in the next 10 minutes or so of this episode of Inner Work Essentials. And I'd like to lead in with the book of this episode, which is, as I mentioned earlier, or hinted at earlier, The Thirst for Wholeness by Christina Grof. Christina Grof is a transpersonal psychologist. She's married to Stanislav Grof, the founder of holotropic breathwork. Maybe you've heard of it. And she had her own struggles with alcohol, which led her to write this book, despite being an incredibly spiritual, cognizant woman. Interestingly, the name of this book, Thirst for Wholeness, came from a phrase that Carl Jung once referred to when he was writing a letter to Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said that one of his patients had a desperation about him, a thirst for wholeness, which was akin to the religious impulse to seek God. And he created this sense of connection that addicts are naturally more spiritual than someone who doesn't face those kinds of challenges. It's an interesting perspective. And if you know anything about 12-step recovery programs, you'll know that one of those key steps is to surrender yourself to an acknowledged higher power. Typically, this is a Christian-based foundation, but in modern, more secular 12-step programs, it's any variant of God, any variant of a higher self concept. But we have to know how to separate that higher self concept from the traumatic baseline. So I'm going to read you a quote from this book, which I think is really illuminating. Here, Christina Grof is talking about where the thirst for wholeness comes from and how addictions are a mistaken mistranslation of that very natural desire to get towards something more. So, from the book. The original thirst for our own wholeness began as a healthy and natural impulse toward personal growth, expansion, and unity with our deeper self. Now our divine goal has become obscured by a growing, self-destructive, and misguided obsession with a substitute. So this is the specific addiction, right? This is the drink, the drug, the sex, the shopping. We're mistaking that urge, that thirst, that reaching, that grasping as being the thing itself. This is where attachment comes in, traumatic attachment in particular. The quote continues, "The addict finds themselves in a terrible dilemma. We have become hopelessly attached or addicted to an activity, a person, or a material substance that is not giving us the satisfaction we long for." This is where a bit of clarity and a bit of ability to hold nuanced multi-level perspective is required. At a simple level, it's very difficult to properly separate the addict as traumatic, or the addict as, I don't like using the word victim, but the addict as someone who is at a point of pain and wounding based on their circumstances, and therefore is trying to cope with it, or trying to self-remedy, and the person who is outside of that addictive identity construct, who is genuinely seeking something noble, something divine and soulful. Unfortunately, based on some of my own journey and the client work that I've been fortunate to be a part of, the day-to-day understanding of am I an addict or am I a genuine spiritual seeker is almost impossible to actually unravel. It's very, very difficult to know if your mystical flight towards religion, or maybe your sense of ritual, your sense of numinosity, your interest in certain ideas which are outside of the mainstream, is an addiction in itself. This is why we need to focus on traumatic attachment as the first step. So traumatic attachment, in a nutshell, is a misrepresented or distorted way of continuing a basic natural biological urge to attach, usually to a caregiver, well, initially to the mother, to attach to certain environmental objects, the mother, the father, certain key figures during our childhood, to create a sense of permanency. If you look at child developmental psychology, there's a period up until about the age of 2 or so, where some psychologists argue that a baby doesn't really have a sense of distinct ego. So they need to latch onto the mother in a way where they feel permanent, like they exist. These are the kind of situations where if a 6-month-old is left crying on their own and doesn't see the mom literally doesn't exist. So the infant, or the infant part of ourselves, to extend that thought experiment away, needs something to attach onto. And especially if things are scary, things are difficult, things have been abusive or transgressive, we have an even stronger urge, like the baby in the crib who's crying and seeking comfort. We have an even stronger urge to grab towards something which will self-remedy, like a pacifier. It's interesting how so many of our addictions are often consumption-based, right? It's often oral, or if it's not oral, it's receiving through the eyes, it's being fixed on screens, it's consuming pornography or consuming entertainment compulsively. It's that word consumption. What we're doing here with traumatic attachment is we're trying to create a new identity construct via a state of being, but it doesn't work. We can't create an identity formation, we can't create, that wasn't so well said, we can't create or form a new sense of safe, solid, okay identity, as in, I am okay, I'm safe, I'm alright. If we're clutching, because the energy of clutching, the energy of seeking in, you can see my energy, right? It's scattered, it's very off-putting, it's very, People can then take this traumatic attachment and move it towards a higher state of being, and although the externals may change, although they may now be interested in certain religious traditions or certain ritualistic practices, maybe of the New Age variety, with things like tarot or new moon rituals or crystals or different angelic beings, or the Jungian variety of getting obsessed with synchronicities and dream work, it's still the same traumatic attachment pattern. We've just sophisticated it with our big brains and our desire for aesthetics. It's not too different from the crying baby in the crib who needs something to suck on to calm down. We're chewing in our mind, we're masticating and self-masturbating on ideas and concepts, but they're all multiple stages away from the core problem, which is unsafety. We're not safe in our bodies just yet because we haven't done the trauma work. An interesting distinction comes up between this traumatic attachment and the genuine self-actualizing urge when we have done the trauma work, because we can start to engage in higher ideals or higher religious impulses in a take-it-or-leave-it fashion. I'll see this all the time with clients. Someone's having their spiritual emergency for the first time. They're really opening up, maybe from an atheistic background or from a certain restrictive religious parental background, into a whole new world of dream work or crystals or new age ideas or ancient hermetic traditions, whatever it may be. And there's that sense of compulsive clutching. It's that same gesture, that same hunger and lack of completion, that traumatic attachment. That's the thirst for wholeness gone astray. Because if there was safety in the body, if there wasn't that crying out or that lonely sense of desperation, we'd be able to approach these higher states of consciousness, these more optimistic elements of human potential, without the desperation which simultaneously and ironically keeps us away from actually attaining those states. The core idea that this leads us to is the very question of how do we turn a temporary state into a permanent trait. I think that's a Ken Wilber phrase, an integral theory phrase. Ken Wilber's a fantastic philosopher if you've never read him. More videos on him later in this series. How do we turn a temporary state into a permanent trait? Because that's what we're seeking through traumatic attachment. We're seeking a temporary state of, let's say with drug escapism, someone takes LSD, or maybe they take a party drug. They're seeking that state of euphoria, connection, divine inspiration, or maybe just having a good time. But that's a stage below the permanent trait. Most people, if they were really pressed, would love to experience a permanent trait of the ability to access those rapture-inducing states in a sober mind, It is possible. Drugs are the easy low-hanging fruit almost to get us there, and it also becomes a self-soothing mechanism to prevent us looking towards the darkness which we're escaping from. This is where things get tricky, right? I can't summarize the whole space of addiction and religiosity and the interplay between the two in just a 15-20 minute video. What I hope is happening is that me talking about all these different ideas, me throwing out different fishing rods and kind of, or maybe seeds is a better metaphor, me planting different seeds of perspective in your mind and in your attention right now, is helping you to see the distinction between parts of you that maybe have that more compulsive, traumatic attachment-based version of substance use or idea seeking and idea expansion, and those parts of you which are more authentically grounded and less destabilized by a sense of chronic emptiness or chronic unsafety, which again is unresolved nervous system tension, which needs trauma work, and prevents you from actually turning that state into a trait. It's turning that peak experience of a higher religious impulse, let's say a vision that you have on drugs. Some people will take drugs to get a high vision of, something past lifey or something, magical of some sort. I'm not saying this is wrong, it's something that I'm not into myself. You'll get a peak experience that then fades down. But the real challenge and the real opportunity of healing from a sober-minded perspective, of becoming the addict turned spiritual addict turned non-addict at all, just a human being who can be detached when necessary, attached when necessary, and walk between the two worlds, is that a peak experience doesn't need to be where it naturally dips down into. If we reduce those spikes upwards and we turn a peak into a plateau and continue there and do the work, another peak into a plateau and continue there, that's a real inner working journey. I'm going to leave it here. This is the thirst for wholeness in a nutshell. I haven't got the answers to every specific version of this, but I hope it's tickled your mind. I hope it's really unlocked a potentially new way of understanding your addictions and a new way of wrapping around your religious impulse or your feeling that you're after something a lot more than the everyday mundane, in a way that really lands, maybe does something. Hopefully it does something. It's a difficult topic to talk about. If you have any particular questions, drop them in the comments below. I'm also always available on Instagram. It's where I hang out a lot. I'm spending a lot of time in DMs. I love one-on-one conversations. But if this has tickled your fancy and you want to learn how to properly distinguish between traumatic attachment and genuine self-actualizing impulse, then we're going to have to learn to take off our emotional armor. We're going to have to learn to take off that rigidity which is keeping us trapped and stopping us from actually accessing our intuition. So if that sounds like something you want to do, next episode of Inner Work Essentials, we're going to learn about rigidity and armoring and how to take it off once and for all. I'll see you over there.